Positive.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid, sporting a Kabale Kid hat. How are you, Shaka?
I still remain simple, easy, and of course, as some of my fans suggest, an awesome son of Africa.
Very interesting. Indeed, an awesome son of Africa. I see you're sporting a very nice hat, courtesy of what? Kabale Kid? Somebody.
Yes. How does it look like?
It looks beautiful.
So it probably helps us walk back
So is this going to
in
be your
memory
new...
lane to Kabale.
Right. Is this going to be your new trademark now?
Oh, and why not? One of these days, I'm going to have the opportunity to go back to Kabale and celebrate, by the way, the 20th anniversary of Straight Talk Africa,
Well,
live.
I look forward to that,
Tape
Shaka.
from Kabale.
A warm welcome to all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll go through a whole a bunch of stories that are happening on the content. But maybe first, let's start by talking about the trip that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State for the United States, is in Africa as we speak. He just maybe finished the meeting with the Ethiopian Prime Minister. He started out in Senegal to Angola, then Ethiopia. Your assessment, Shaka?
You know, it is very interesting that he has gone to 3 African countries. One of them, you mentioned Senegal. Senegal is a former, essentially what you would call Francophone African country, very strategic in West Africa, and very democratic, by the way. And then you talk about Angola. Angola is a former Russophonic country under the Portuguese, who never really wanted to leave. And then he goes to Ethiopia. And of course, Ethiopia, you remember your history very well, I'm sure. It is one of those few countries, if any, that were never politically colonized by other countries.
The Italians can claim that they attempted.
They didn't quite really colonize it. They went in during the Second World War so as to revenge the Battle of Adwa, which they had miserably lost almost 100 years earlier. But it's very interesting because the U.S. obviously is the lone superpower, and as a superpower, it has its vital national security interests. And the focus, of course, has been, for the most part, the war against terrorism. So when you look at Ethiopia happens to be a key ally in terms of that war, in terms of the security, especially because of Al-Shabaab and you name it. And Senegal also happens to be in a region where you also have these other terrorists called Boko Haram. So it makes sense. And of course, when you talk about Angola, the American companies make tons and tons of money in Angola because of oil, because of diamonds, because of you name it.
It's interesting that you talked about some of the strategic interests for United States, and I'm surprised you didn't mention Uganda, or Pompeo didn't go to Uganda, because Ugandan soldiers are dying on behalf of America in Somalia.
You're right, Paul, but the last time I checked, I have absolutely no part in making those types of decisions. When it comes to that, I think I'm comfortable in saying that I'm eminently underqualified to do that. But you definitely have a point. Uganda, in fact, has been a sort of linchpin, if you will, in terms of especially the fight against Al-Shabaab. It maintains the single largest contingent under AMISOM in Mogadishu.
Can fighting terrorism or this extremism, people like to call it, really, is it more of an ideological thing? Is it a political thing? Or is it something that can be resolved by bombing people out of their caves?
There are actually some pundits who think that fighting terrorism is wishful thinking, especially using the military aspect of it, because in fact these same pundits think that what really is needed is for these countries to identify the fundamental root causes of why these young people are engaged in what these people characterize as terrorism, so that they can deny them the ground, the space to do this. They should, for example, come up with packages of education, packages of providing skill sets and what have you, so that these young people can learn the skills so that they can become useful members of society. And so it looks like it's taken very, very long. And it reminds me of a one-time genius, Professor Albert Einstein, who frankly at one time suggested that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, that he called insanity.
Shaka, you brought up a very good example, and if you don't mind, I would like to go back to it. You said that maybe perhaps the United States can figure out a way of maybe trying to engage these kids by maybe giving them education scholarships and other things that can maybe enable them to be active members of the society. But there are groups like Boko Haram, for example, even Al-Shabaab, that are totally against Western type of education. They want people to stay the way they are.
Yeah, but that's not exactly what I said. I hope that you are not quoting me. Basically, really, what I'm thinking is the United States and other world powers working in collaboration with these African countries where there are those types of problems, those types of concerns, and coming up with an educational package that helps to equip these young people with skill sets. For example, they can teach you how to fish if you live next to an ocean, and some of these countries are very close to oceans. If you live very close to a river, you live very close to a lake and all that kind of stuff, they can teach you a lot of different things that can generate income and can therefore really divert your focus on thinking that when you actually hold an AK-47, it has the potential to liberate you.
But how about those who argue that, for example, education, there are a lot of young people who are highly educated on the African continent, but they don't have jobs. They can't use those skills they have acquired to acquire any job, good paying job. That's why a lot of them are trying to flee the continent. And those who are remaining are also being recruited into these by these terrorism groups operating both in North Africa and in some parts of the Horn of Africa.
Could it be possible that perhaps what you are describing as education is in fact at the end of the day not education, or not appropriate education for that matter? You have to look at the type of education that somehow reflects or addresses the obtaining social, economic, cultural, political needs. You have to look for that. Yeah. You have to, for example, if you teach someone to be a mechanic, there better be automobiles or cars to be fixed, or engines, or that kind of stuff. So I think that we should be looking for the type of education that is relevant to each particular community or society or country for that matter, but not simply, for example, reading stuff that you're going to be repeating and repeating, but in fact does not have the effect of bringing food on the table. We need something that is practical, something that is pragmatic, something that when you talk about development, and you are citing, for example, percentages of, development and what have you, and I have seen some African rulers, talking about how their countries have developed since they came on board by citing statistics. But when you think about it, some of those statistics, in fact, do not reflect, essentially, do not really reflect what actually is or should be or ought to be in their stomach. Yeah. Do not reflect what is happening or not happening in a community and all that kind of stuff. And so some people will say that probably is a result or a reflection of what they would call creative accounting.
Interesting. Let's move on. Let's go to South Sudan. Mm-hmm. The leaders are at it again. They're trying to figure out a way of finally coming together, but they still have, they're still weighing, they're still procrastinating about whether or not they should go ahead and implement the peace process that they have been working on.
When I look at South Sudan and what is going on, to be very honest with you, I feel so sad, because I don't honestly think that the people of South Sudan should be going through these type of motions. It is a country that is incredibly wealthy, but unfortunately it has people, at least some leaders or rulers, who obviously have demonstrated that they really do not love their people. If they did, they wouldn't be doing what they are doing up to now. Because let's face it, I hope that Africa at some point is going to be having people in positions of power who come up with policies that help to put a smile on their people's faces, rather than coming up with policies or decisions sincerely that, on the contrary, actually specialize in putting misery on their people's faces. There's no reason, for example, sincerely, why an ordinary South Sudanese should not be very comfortable living in that country. They should be having a guarantee of 3 meals a day. Their children should be actually going to school, learning a skill, and what have you, and beginning to believe sincerely that there is this thing called independence, and that this independence from Sudan can actually translate into what is called hope, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But unfortunately, you have some selfish individuals here. Recently, of course, the president, Salva Kiir Mayardit, did a good thing. Under enormous pressure of both IGAD and IGAD Plus, he agreed that he was reverting to the original 10 states in South Sudan. And he had actually come up with 32.
Yeah, but also creatively, he came up with some administrative structures.
He should not be allowed to do that. And in fact, he did that specifically in areas where you find the lifeline of the country.
And that's where the conflict has been.
Oil.
Yes.
Yes. And then the issue of national security, the issue of actually creating a national army, the issue of allowing these different forces to be in a cantonment and all that kind of stuff. Why should that be impossible? This is not rocket science. I think that Africa should be tired of having these people in positions of office who specialize sincerely, again, in putting misery on the faces of their people.
Interesting. Let's go to some of our comments, Facebook comments. Let's start with Waswa Patrick, Mr. Shaka. Don't you think that Western imperialists like the US and the UK are hindering the growth of democracy? They are the ones protecting dictators in Africa. Let me also go to another quick one here from Kayumba. There are some cases where dictatorships are supported by Western powers, results into rebel groups, and these rebel groups are tagged as terrorists. For example, the RPF was called a terrorist organization, but when Kagame came to power, all his political opponents are either terrorists or genocide deniers.
Actually, I don't remember the RPF being, characterized as a terrorist organization. I don't know by who, for example. This RPF was actually supported by the United States of America. It was started by the United Kingdom, government. And these are two very important countries which are members and permanent members, in fact, of the UN Security Council. So the RPF was seen and viewed as a legitimate liberation struggle, a liberation kind of, force that was fighting against an autocratic regime in Kigali, which was headed by Major General Juvenal Habyarimana. And there are a lot of people, including myself as a journalist, who actually thought that what they were actually fighting for was justified, because you couldn't think of a people to be permanent refugees in Africa. Later on, really, for an African to be a refugee in Africa, it simply doesn't make sense. It's not that there was not enough room for people to be accommodated. It is simply that some rulers were basically very selfish, very narrow, very pettish. And it is very unfortunate that the RPF is pretty much almost borrowing from the same leaf or same template.
It's like you're reading my lips. I was about to ask you the same
really?
thing. Yeah.
I mean, you are talking about a situation where a liberator and a former victim of oppression, in fact, becomes an oppressor.
Interesting. Let's go to a quick follow-up from Charles Ashimba Jr. What's your view on the suicidal of Kizito Mihigo, which left many questions unanswered? And we are talking about a younger guy, gospel singer in Rwanda, who until recently was one of those rising stars, very, very talented in every way you can describe the young man. But so surprisingly, the news coming out of Rwanda is that this guy was found dead.
I don't really want to jump to conclusions because I don't have the facts. I normally like to have the facts and give them legs so that they can walk me where I take my audience. But unfortunately, the government of Rwanda has been doing so many things that are so unpleasant, things that people sometimes wonder whether in fact there is someone in charge of the store, to such an extent that sometimes their explanation is not something that someone can think about putting on his or her own bank account. And so it's very, very difficult for them to convince, for example, the public, both their own domestic public and the region and the international community, that this young man, who was an incredible artist, using essentially music to mobilize people, to sensitize people to actually become socially and politically aware of their rights, so that they can therefore demand that the system provides them with social, economic, political justice as a people. So I think it is very unfortunate, but I think that the international community should actually weigh in. And beginning with African countries. We need to see the African countries actually taking a lead before we think about, quote unquote, the international community.
By the way, I should mention that this young man that we are talking about was a known critic of the regime in Kigali.
You see, Paul, the problem that I think we have in Rwanda and just like we have in a lot of African countries, especially those that are democratically challenged, is that individuals are not allowed or even to feel that they actually have a right to own an opinion that is different, for example, from the ruling elite or from the ruler. That is part of the problem, and that's part of the reason why Africa is not even developing.
Yeah, let's go back to South Sudan. Let's go to Good Congo Call. South Sudan is experiencing hard situation due to the conflict. What do you think the future holds for South Sudanese?
But we've been there before. I mean, we've talked about South Sudan. I mean, really.
Okay, let's move on, Shaka. Let's go. Let's go to Arul Yol, also from South Sudan. What do you think Africa can? Do you think Africa can be a strong economic and political player in the world?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's no question about it. What is actually missing are leaders who, for example, reflect what I would call like the 4 C's. Leaders that are conscious, leaders that have character, leaders that have courage to make decisions that are in the interest of their people, leaders that care about country, community, that kind of stuff. Not leaders or rulers who are patriotic to their stomachs, the stomachs of their families, and their friends, not society. We also need to have leaders, sincerely, who reflect what I call the 3 B's. Leaders who can come, address their people very briefly, and with ideas that are bright, and in a manner that is bold. Those are the type of leaders that are actually lacking in Africa. You know, if it can be done somewhere else, Paul, why can't it be done in Africa, which is in fact supposed to be the cradle of man? That's where all people originated from.
Yeah,
so we'll look at China. I grew up during the time China experienced a revolution, and I had a leader called Chairman Mao Zedong. This man isolated China in order to unite it so that it can become a united nation state. And when this man died, this man that replaced him, Deng Xiaoping, this man came with an incredible theory. He said, yes, China is a socialist state, but we need to figure out how to build this type of socialism so that it can be reflected in people's stomachs. And so he came up, Paul, with something interesting. He said, I do not care about the color of the skin of the cat. What I care about is whether the cat can catch a mouse. And therefore, what he was saying essentially is, if in fact there are some good things in capitalism which can help us to build and develop our country as a socialist nation, why not? And guess what? Talk about China. The China that we actually live with right now happens to sit on the 2nd largest economy in the world. The China that we talk about is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council.
Right.
The China that we talk about is arguably the factor of the world.
Right.
And how does it get the resources that it actually needs to use in order to become what it is? It gets most of them from where you and I come from Africa. If you talk about oil, they get oil from Angola. They get oil from Nigeria, from Gabon, you name it. When you talk about copper, they get it from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They get it from Zambia. When you talk about cobalt, all those types of things. When you talk about, for example, coltan, with your iPhone, smartphone, video phone, and what have you, it comes from Africa.
Yeah.
So what Africa lacks is leadership. There is a leadership deficit. Africa needs to have leaders, and I have not lost hope because the world is not static, it is dynamic.
But Shaka, are you suggesting that on the entire African continent there are no leaders who are aspiring to become a China? There are leaders who have claimed that what they are doing for their countries is akin, or you can link it to what China has done over the years.
For example?
Rwanda claims to be on the verge of becoming the next, for example, tech hub in Africa.
Maybe it claims to be the Singapore of Africa?
Absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
You basically actually said it yourself. You say claims.
Yes.
Yes. Which raises questions. You see, it's not simply about talking the talk. One has to be able to walk the talk so that people can in fact walk the walk. So when we talk about China sitting on the second largest economy in the world, we are not talking about claims here.
But one could argue that China is tightly controlled, Rwanda is tightly controlled. Everything that happens in China, the top government people have a hand or know what's really happening. When you look at Rwanda, it's pretty much the same thing. It looks like Rwanda has borrowed a template from China, but and one could argue that they're actually looking at maybe in a few years' time to be at a level where no other country will be in Africa.
You see, some of those things that you are talking about make sense, but the reality is different. China is not simply about talking the talk. China, the last time I checked, there is, information that is so copious that will tell you that it has actually lifted in the last, say, like 10 years, lifted probably more than 20 million people from poverty. These are things that you can actually touch and feel. China is actually developing so much on our backs in Africa.
But so is Rwanda, one of the fastest growing countries.
I don't know about that.
Africa.
Again, when you talk about fastest growing economy, you are talking about statistics. The question is, to what extent do those statistics, in fact, to what extent are they reflected in Rwandans' stomachs? To what extent are those statistics reflected in Rwanda's neighborhood? Rwanda is still a very dependent country on foreign aid, the last time I checked. So I don't see really what kind of case you are making here. We need Africans in those positions. Africans, again, as I said earlier, who will come up with policies, who will make decisions that put a smile on the children of Africa, not putting misery on people's faces. I mean, it's unconscionable. How can we inherit a continent that is sincerely so rich, so wealthy, and yet our people are so poor? We have very few countries like South Africa, for example, where some things are happening. I was looking at the script, and somebody, in fact, was wondering whether you can actually have democracy in Africa in a place where there is no homogeneity. But you can actually have democracy in South Africa, where there is one group, the Ngonis, who have actually dominated in terms of ruling, because they are Zulus, they are Xhosa, Swazi, they are Venda.
So unfortunately, Shaka, we've run out of time. It's always a pleasure having you on set. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
To you all, thank you so much for watching. Keep those comments coming. We look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, thank you so much. So long from Washington.